Good evening, everyone, and welcome. We have opened the virtual door to the classroom, and so you've all been allowed into the classroom. Currently showing there are 123 of you. You should see up on your screen the continuing education elimination of the verbal appeal, along with today's date, as well as a list of the instructors for the class. My clock on my phone is showing 6:01 p.m., so we're going to get started. Welcome to Continuing Education for the ITA. Today's topic is the elimination of the verbal appeal. Hopefully this was, I know it was covered during all of your certification classes that you all attended, but given the importance of this topic, we wanted to make sure we addressed it again. If you don't recognize the voice that's speaking, my name is Anthony Montero. I am the chair of the ITA National Officials Committee. I am joined tonight by two very illustrious instructors. The first is Rebel Good. Rebel is from the North Carolina area, is also a member of the ITA National Officials Committee. Also, the second person joining me and instructing tonight is Andrew Rogers. Andrew Rogers is from Chattanooga, Tennessee, and he is a member of our illustrious ITA faculty. In addition to myself, Rebel and Andrew have worked ITA National Championships as chair umpires. They have Andrew has also been the head referee for the women's ITA, excuse me, the women's ITA team indoor national championship, which along with the men's team indoor national championship was run when it was last held with the no verbal appeal rule. So all of us have experience with the no verbal appeal and with implementation of it at the highest levels of collegiate tennis. We're going to get started. We're just going to jump right in. If we could go to the next slide. There we go. This is the only slide we're going to have, but this is really what we plan to talk about tonight. We're going to talk very, very briefly on why this rule, and then we're going to talk about the what of this rule, which is just what it is literally, kind of a walk through the rule. And that discussion will be led, I'm going to lead the discussion on why. The discussion on what will be led by Andrew. And then Rebel will lead the discussion on the how. All three of us will talk because I don't think you keep all three of us quiet even if we wanted to, but all three of us will talk throughout, but those are going to be the discussion leaders. As I stated, Rebel will be doing the how, which is going to be some practical pointers and some just, nuts and bolts implementation of this. So I will jump right in with the why, and we're going to spend the least amount of time on this, but we did get some questions on it. You all had the opportunity to submit questions. We did get a couple questions on why this rule, so we want to address it briefly. Just for your information, this rule actually was originated, I was actually present the first time it came up, but it was originated at the ITA Division I Operating Committee, which is all coaches. It's combined men's and women's coaches, combined representation from all over the country and all levels. It has, the Power 5 representative, the mid-majors, and some of the non-mid-majors as well. It was initially brought up, and they wanted to do it immediately. There was wide consensus. I actually found it a little bit shocking. Like they wanted to just pass a rule that eliminated it. I was present at that operating committee meeting as an observer, and so I raised my hand and said, how about doing a more phased approach? Let's at least test it on a pilot level and see where it goes, and then implement it the following year, which is ultimately what happened. So it was done as a pilot level. It was implemented first for all of the fall championship events. Then it was implemented at the kickoff weekend, so all of the 15 kickoff weekend sites for both the men and the women. And then it was culminated in being implemented at both the men's and women's ITA Team Indoor National Championships. I just want to dispel some disbeliefs. This rule does not result from any dissatisfaction with officiating, any complaint about officials. In fact, officiating wasn't even the main discussion when this rule was discussed. The genesis of this rule was a lot of coaches across the spectrum, men's and women's, and like I said, across the various levels, felt that the verbal appeal had picked up a kind of antagonistic approach or result, not approach, result. In other words, Andrew and I are playing and we're friends, or friendly at least, and the fact that I keep asking the chair umpire, was that ball good? Was that ball good? Andrew is getting mad at me because Andrew is interpreting that as I'm basically saying he's lying, he's making bad calls. And several coaches talked about how they had players who were good friends who, after playing a match under the collegiate rules, there was some animosity because, you know, the one kept saying to the other, why did you keep challenging all my calls? So they wanted, that was the genesis. Now, I understand that there's strong opinions on both sides, whether this is a good or a bad thing. I have my own opinions on whether this is a good or bad thing, but that's kind of all irrelevant. I just want to make clear on the why that the genesis was sportsmanship and sportsmanship among the players. It was not any dissatisfaction with officials or officiating. Likewise, you know, one other thing that was a positive that was brought up by several coaches, and to be totally frank, something I'm interested to see if this, you know, rule continues for 3-5 years, is this does bring us more in line with the USTA's officiating. You know, it was a source of contention a few years ago when the whole divorce happened. So I think that it will open the door for more cross training, more opportunities on both sides to have training together, because this rule really did segregate college tennis and make it unique from any other segment of the tennis population. So those are the reasonings behind the why. That is how it came about. I just want to reiterate, not, you know, I've had people say things like, well, you know, if people were unsatisfied with the officials, why didn't they bring these concerns? That was dissatisfaction with officiating wasn't even discussed. You know, so that was not one of the reasons or genesis behind this rule. And so with that, I think we can move right along to the what. I just wanted to briefly talk about the why.
Well, thank you, Anthony. Well said. And welcome, everyone. I'm very glad that all of you have joined us this evening. As Anthony was said earlier, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Andrew Rogers, and very happy to be here this evening and talking with all of you kind of regarding what's happening and what's going on in the current world of college officiating. And so just briefly to kind of talk about some of the what and exactly what this is. I know we covered a lot of these kinds of topics in our certification webinars, and I won't try not to dispel too far into Rebel to your how we're going to go about this. But essentially, the first thing that I want to kind of just kind of go over when we talk about what this is as we talk about as we kind of transition from where we were and dispel some of the thoughts and some of the rumors. The primary responsibility, and the first thing I want to say is the primary responsibility for all initial line calls still remains with the players. So essentially what is happening now, and so often we are, as chair umpires, as roving officials, every time a ball is hit to a line, close to a line, we are, whether, you know, we're not verbalizing things, but we are making, you know, in our head those calls as to what's happening. But the primary responsibility for making a line call is going to remain with the player. We are not going to be making any line calls. So with that being said, if a player plays a ball as good, we are never in any situation going to be calling that ball out. Conversely, what we will be immediately correcting is any ball that is called out by the player that is we see as a chair umpire or as a roving umpire. We will be immediately correcting any erroneous out call. So any ball that's called out by the player that we see as in, we will be immediately correcting that ball. So that's kind of the what as to what's happening here. The one thing that we will kind of, I think that's important to think about as far as we're going through some of these as part of the what, and Anthony and Rebel, feel free to jump in if I miss anything as we're going through. As I know some of the questions that come through is, okay, well, in USTA tennis, what do we do with a player that obviously plays a ball that's obviously out? What happens on a we're not going to be calling any of those balls out. We're only going to be correcting those erroneous calls that are balls that are called out that we see as in. Also along those lines, the only situation that will remain in ITA tennis with an appeal will be that first service fault. So we say that the server hits a serve, the receiver plays that serve as good. You as the chair umpire or as the roving umpire, in that situation, you see the serve as out, whether that was long or wide. You see the serve as out. Nothing is changing regarding the servers or servers partner in doubles with their ability to appeal that first service fault. So as we know from in the past, the server they're allowed to hit a volley or a half volley and then quickly appeal, or if they stay in the backcourt, they're not allowed to make a play on that next ball. They're allowed to appeal that first service fault. That's the only situation where we're going to have the appeal process that's still in place in this particular situation. And in that situation, when the server appeals that first service fault, as the chair umpire, as the roving official, you would say, yes, the ball was out, second serve. But we are not going to be making any initial line calls for the players. I think that's kind of the main point as to the what is happening in the situation. A little bit of Rebel, do you want me to kind of get into some of the practical areas and how this is going to kind of, as we think through some of this, or do you want to kind of jump in now and talk about a few things with regards to how some of that's going to happen, or do you want me to kind of go through some of the other sides of that?
Well, I'll be more than happy to come in at this point and just talk about the nuts and bolts of overruling.
Sure, Rebel. Before you do that, I apologize to everyone. I jumped in so fast. The one thing I did want to say is because of the number of people on this webinar, we will not be having you raise your hand with over 100 participants. That would just be near impossible. However, you still have the opportunity to ask questions. We have officials who are reviewing the question box. So if you have a question based on anything that anyone says, you can type it into the question box and it will be relayed to us. But we just can't, with this many people, have you raise the hand and unmute you like we would in a class because it'll devolve too quickly. So sorry, Rebel, to interrupt, and go ahead.
No problem whatsoever, Anthony. This is obviously a major change for us in procedure and technique. And what's important for each of us as officials as we go forward with this is that we groove our procedures and techniques so that there's a consistency to what we're doing, and we don't appear, well, it just will increase our credibility up there if we're consistent in how we do this. We do it properly, and do it consistently. So this is going to be very basic, but I want to make these points to you. First off, these relate to being a chair umpire or a roving umpire, and that there is no far sideline umpire out there. So use your basic chair umpiring techniques, tracking the ball throughout the point. When a ball lands close to a line, instantly decide whether you see it in or out. If you see it in and you hear or see it called out, look to the player making the call and immediately announce, correction, the ball was good, and announce the score. If you see it out and it is called out, look to the loser, the other player, give a confirming hand signal and announce the score. That was the picture we had on our opening slide of Darren there with the confirming hand signal. Note that in both cases, you're following the basic technique that you've always been taught about looking to the loser of the point. It's just that the loser could be either player, depending upon whether you're confirming the call or overruling the call. Also note that if you see a close shot in and no out call is made, you do not make a confirming hand signals. We are not giving safe signs from the chair or as a roving official. So that's the sequence of events that we want you to use, whether you're a chair umpire or a roving umpire in direct observation of a court, so that you track that ball, you see it land, you make an instant decision, and then you instantly either confirm the out call or you overrule. You confirm or overrule instantly, looking in the proper direction. If you do that and you're timely in doing this, it will cut down on so many problems. It will reduce the players at the beginning of the season, at least, and probably for a good while, are going to want to appeal. And the more timely you are and the more credible you appear in making your confirming calls or your overrules, the more you will cut down on them jumping in and making appeals. So those are the basic hows on overruling. Now, that's without a far sideline umpire. With a far sideline umpire, it gets hairier. What we have talked about is simply when if you have a far sideline umpire and a ball is hit very close to the line and it is called out, we want you to use your far sideline umpire. So you should immediately jump in then, unless it is obviously out to you, and simply say to your far side, how did you see it? And then confirm their call. If they give you a safe sign, you will say, correction, the ball was good. And if they confirm the outside, just nod your head, whatever, announce the score, and move on. So those are the hows, Anthony and Andrew. If you all would care to chime in on those techniques and procedures, please do.
Rebel and Andrew, couple thoughts or questions from either of you, or from either of you. First one, what are your thoughts on what is timely for an overrule?
And that's a great question, and I think that's obviously one of the main things that people have come to me as kind of what's going on with this, and kind of the general rule of thumb that I used as I was having these conversations with officials, say at the team indoor, was to me, and I think Rebel brought up a really good point when he was talking about the how of maintaining your credibility, and don't lose your credibility when you're making that overrule. And so for me, as a chair umpire or as a referee watching this situation unfold, let's say a ball gets hit to the baseline. As a chair umpire, I'm tracking that ball to the baseline, as Rebel said. the ball lands, I'm immediately deciding, what if I saw that ball in or out. Let's say I see that ball as coming right through that baseline. The ball's called out by the player. What I don't want to see, and let me say what I don't want to see as a referee, I don't want to see that chair umpire, I don't want to see their head come up and turn and look at the opponent. Because once they've come up and they've turned and they've looked to the opponent, and then the opponent is verbalizing something, the opponent is doing whatever the opponent's doing, in my mind, that's when we start to lose credibility as a chair umpire or as a roving umpire. We're starting to lose credibility as whether or not we were going to make that overrule. So even if the overrule is not completely instantaneous, or let's just say that, for example, somehow that player is able to verbalize some type of an appeal, whether that's, oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding me, whatever that is, if I'm focused on the court where the ball landed, and that's coming out of that player's mouth before I'm able to actually say, correction, the ball was good, I'm not going to limit my ability to make that overrule. Because in my mind, as a chair umpire, as a referee watching this, as long as that overrule is coming while that the chair umpires is focused on the court where that ball landed, I'm okay with that overrule. What are your thoughts on that, Rebel and Anthony?
Well, let me just say this. First off, let's start with the pre-match meeting, and remind the players that we are correcting, we will overrule obvious mistakes, and that they are no longer appealing calls. And we're going to have to remind them of this probably multiple times during the match, but we should start with the pre-match. And I think you can tell them if you make a slow call, or they slip in some words before you get the words correction, the ball was good, out, after you make the overrule, we need to say something to them and just remind them and go, remember, I'm overruling immediately. I cannot overrule on your appeal, and you're not supposed to be appealing.
I totally agree with both of you. I can't tell anyone on this call, it's 2.3 seconds, and then after that, it's untimely. It's going to be your good judgment. I mean, I can certainly tell you if the coach, from the other team has come up and argued with you, and it's like 5 seconds after the call, yeah, you better not be overruling now. That is way too late. That is not timely. That is not an immediate overrule. But have I ever overruled maybe a second or two? Yes. And in that scenario, I know in my head that my overrule is a little late. I had better be prepared to explain that to the coach if he or she is going to come at me. And the answer there is going to be, coach, I could have been quicker, but I am 100% the call was incorrect. Something along those.
Let me throw this in here. If from a timeliness standpoint, you need to remain engaged in looking at the line and where the ball landed. If you lose that engagement, then I would say at that point you can't overrule.
That's a great point.
Then you're waiting. Then you're listening to somebody else. But if you see the ball hit and you're sort of processing it in your mind, and you've still got your eye on that spot, and a player's going, whoa, 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 that's okay for you to go, correction, the ball was good. You're still engaged with making the call. Once you leave it, you're on your own, buddy.
And I think, I think you're exactly right. And I think as we were kind of thinking of the way we kind of used to do things, where we would see that ball land on that baseline, and then we would turn and look to the opponent, or turn, we would pick our head up or whatever we were doing to see if that appeal was coming, whatever that might be. Now we need to be, we need to keep our eyes focused on that spot where that ball landed. And I think you're exactly right, Anthony. I mean, there's not a specific set time where we are if it takes X number of seconds and that overrule was too late. I mean, I think it, like you said, I mean, it's ultimately the judgment of the chair umpire, the judgment of the referee as to whether or not that overrule was timely. But we don't want to lose that credibility where we've picked our head up and now all of a sudden we're looking at the opponent. Then the appeal comes, and now it seems like, yeah, we're overruling simply because he's asking us about that call. And I think that's where we get to be in situations that it's going to be really tough to defend that to the coach that comes over and argues when he says, well, you only overruled that because he asked you. That's a harder sell at that point.
If I may, let me remind everyone that we are only supposed to rule if we're absolutely certain, that we have no doubt. And if you leave the shot and the point and time elapses, that certainly is an indication of doubt to somebody.
Good point.
That's why you either have to be right on it or you certainly have to be engaged, because once you show any doubt, once again, your credibility goes out the window.
Yeah.
Now
sorry, go ahead, Ro.
I was just going to say, let me just throw in one other thing with regard to timing, because we did have a question about what is the timing if you do have a far sideline umpire, and my answer would be the timing is still exactly the same. You're going to have to say, how'd you see that, in the same time frame that you would have said, correction, the ball is good.
Great point. Great point. The only other thing I will add, and Andrew and Rebel both alluded to this, as a practical matter, while I was doing this, the hardest thing the first few matches was conditioning myself not to immediately turn to the opponent. And as Rebel and Andrew have both alluded to, the way to do that, go back to the basics. Remember, keep your eye on the ball, keep your eye on the spot of impact. But the hardest thing, when you have now 100% that ball is good, I know it was good, you find your neck just out of habit wants to start turning, and moving towards the opposing player to see if there's going to be a verbal appeal. And that was the hardest practical application of this rule that I had to unteach my body. Next question, Rebel and Andrew. You kind of answered this, but I just want to make sure we hit it. We can probably hit this very quickly. Rebel, you could probably hit this very quickly because we did kind of answer it. But just because, some opponents are very fast, and just because they get out a no way or a does that prohibit you from overruling?
No, not so long as you're engaged with the shot.
Yes, great.
And somebody also has asked about, whose judgment is it as to whether it was late or not. That's a question of law, and so you can make an overrule, and a player or a coach can complain about you taking too long, and they can ask for the referee, and the referee is going to come out there, and then it's going to be up to the referee. And if I were the referee called to court, I would be asking my roving umpire or line umpire the questions about their technique that we've just discussed here now. When did you make the call? Did you, were you still watching where the ball landed when you made your overrule, or had you turned to somebody else? What would you do, Anthony, if you were the referee and called to court to find out about a late or not late overrule?
I agree, and at best, the best, I'm going to be able to tell the coach, I'll sit here and watch and see, but I've spoken to the chair umpire or the rover, and he or she says that he has stayed on the call and has made an immediate call. But I'll stay here and watch the next one to see if there is an issue with the timeliness. But the best their answer they're going to get from me. But totally agree. I'm going to ask the chair umpire what transpired, make sure they're following the basic techniques, and then move on.
And let's also remember that the opposite of this, of making the overrule, is confirming an out call, and we need to be just as prompt in confirming an out call as we would be in making an overrule.
Great point.
Yeah, I think you're
And
exactly right.
in fact, confirming the out call, I was impressed having implemented it, like we said, at 2 large national events. Confirming that out call, the quicker you're doing that, the quicker the entire incident is just, it's not even going to become an incident. Because the player is immediately looking at you, seeing your hand out, you're selling that, you're firm, you're confident, then they're not even saying a word.
Yeah, and I like the word, that you use too, Rebel, is talking about being engaged, and I think that's it. And to your point there, Anthony, as well, is we demonstrate that we're engaged in that situation, and as you do this throughout the course of a match, you're developing a rapport with the players, and you're developing that so that when those calls do happen. And you may, and obviously we're going to have to, as especially initially, remind players about the whole appeal thing. But that was the thing that I was most surprised about in watching this being implemented in those events, was how much it really did cut down, especially on the women's side, but even on the men's side as well. It cuts down a tremendous amount of the appeal process and the oh my gosh, you've got to be kidding me's, when immediately when that ball lands and that ball's called out, when the chair umpire has turned and immediately confirmed that to the player, it really is cutting down a lot of that back and forth. And I think one thing that is that it was really important is as we think about uh, to Anthony's initial comments about the why of this rule. I think that is something that we're going to be seeing a lot from coaches, and I guess if we want to go ahead and jump into that a little bit, is we're going to be seeing more of more concern on behalf of the coaches of how are we going to be handling these players that are continuing to appeal. And so I'll throw that out just like you did, Anthony. Your guys' thoughts on how we're going to be handling that situation, because I think that is certainly from my experience in being at the coaches meetings for the men's and women's indoors, that was the most talked about topic from the coaches' side of how are we going to deal with a player that still appeals the call. What's going to be kind of our recourse, or what's going to be our response to that player?
Um, Great question. Uh, so I'll start with the what Rebel already mentioned, and the most obvious, being proactive. I think the first step to answering this is make sure you cover it in your pre-match. Just remind them that, you know what, they don't need to appeal. You're going to overrule if you're 100% convinced the call is incorrect. So I think be proactive on that part. I want to make sure we emphasize that. If I'm in the chair, or if I'm watching a chair umpire as the head referee, and there is one tight call in the match and a player says, oh my gosh, how was that? And I quickly hold up, my out signal as the chair umpire, I'm not going to say anything. It was one tight call. It was a tight call. I think it was a tight call. And that's all the player has done. I'm probably one time just going to let it go. But now, if that same player is doing it another time or a third time in the game, yeah, I am going to interject and say, hey, as I told you in the pre-match, I'm handling the overrules. You do not and should not appeal. If it's a little more less loud, less casual and stuff, I might decide that I don't need to do that in the middle of the game. I might wait till the changeover. It's going to depend on the facts and my good judgment. I'm not going to say I'm always going to wait to the changeover, because if the player is being really loud and he's done it 2 times, 3 times in a row, I might do it right then and there just to kind of stop it. If it continued after that, I'm going to have to make a judgment. I would probably, to be totally honest, if it still continued, then on the changeover, I'm going to give a more stern warning to the player. Hey, I've asked you once, you need to stop appealing. you do it again, it could be a code violation. And then I'm going to have to make the judgment based on that. But I don't, this is a judgment high area, in my opinion. A lot of it's going to depend on, did they do it twice over one set? That's not really the end of the world. Did they do it 7 times in one game, including several calls that I didn't even think were that close? Well, now I've got someone who I think perhaps is playing games and trying to get into the head of the opponent and is trying to break this rule. I mean, so all of that's going to factor into how strongly I react. But if it remains a continuing problem, I think you are going to have to deal with it because it's not going to magically go away.
Anthony, we have people who are asking questions about who we should be looking at, or if we're remaining engaged looking at a spot, then we can't be looking at the loser. Let's not get hung up on this engagement part, because frankly, I don't want you staring at a line for 2 or 3 seconds after the ball is hit. You need to be following your basic techniques, and they will take you through all of this, because if you overrule immediately, you are looking immediately as you overrule at the person who made the bad call. If you are confirming the out call immediately, you're putting your finger in the air and you're looking at that person who hit the ball out. So we're not losing sight of players in any case, and the possibility that they might be acting out after losing a point. We're not staring at a line.
Somebody asked about video review situations. I'm going to only cover this very quickly because remember, there are only 14 schools with some type of video review. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because it only applies to 14 schools. But if you're at a school with the approved video review procedures, nothing changes. Once again, whenever the final decision, the elimination of the verbal appeal does not affect video review. You would still overrule or not overrule. Whoever loses the point when it's all over would retain the right to challenge video review. And that's it. Nothing changes for video review with this process. Rebel or Andrew, so you've had a couple overrules, and at the changeover, the player comes up and says to you that's been overruled twice, very professionally. I want to be clear, no profanity, no unprofessionalism. I don't like the way you're calling this match, or you know what, I just don't like those 2 calls that you made. Can you, as the chair umpire, say, hey, there's no verbal appeals, you're not allowed to talk to me?
No. I don't think I'm going to go down that road. Unless you want to have a really long rest of your match. And I think the reality and the relevant, I guess I don't want to say relevant teaching point, but what we need to be thinking about is the fact that by virtue of us saying, or by fact that we're saying there's no longer a verbal appeal, players can't appeal calls. It's not eliminating a player's ability to have a conversation with you as a chair umpire or as a roving umpire. We're not telling a player that, no, you may not speak to me anymore. No, you're not allowed to have a conversation with me about a line call. Players are still allowed to respectfully and professionally have the ability to have that conversation, certainly when they come up to you at a changeover. And I think that that's definitely something that we should respectfully respond to the player in that situation.
Rebel, anything? Yeah, I just want to be clear, and I think Andrew said it better than I could. Do not use this rule to somehow say that the players can't talk to you anymore. They can communicate with you provided they're being professional, and it is not in any way meant to eliminate a player discussing an issue with the match with the chair umpire.
Let's talk for just a moment about good calls. Correct calls. and our technique on those. I would say that if a ball is within about 6 inches of the line, certainly within 6 inches of the line, that is called out and you see out, that you need to be making a confirming call. Anthony or Andrew, what do you feel about that distance? How short or long would you go?
You're asking how, before, how short or long before, if it's before we're confirming that the player got that call correct?
How far out would a shot be and you still are giving a confirming finger?
Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I was confused for a second. Now I understand.
6 inches, a foot, 2 feet, 3 feet.
Obviously, I think more experienced officials, it's going to be shorter. With less experienced officials, it might be a little longer until they build up their comfort level. I don't necessarily want to commit to a distance, per se, but I think it's going to be in the 2 inches or less area. But a lot of times it isn't so much how far out it is, it's whether when I look over at the player, are they staring at me, or do they need some affirmation, or do they just accept the call? So I think that's going to be part of it as well.
Yeah, and I think some of it's situational too. I mean, as you kind of go through a match, you see at times balls that if it's a really big point, if it's a deuce point at 4-all in the third set, and I think, yeah, I mean, if it's a baseline or a long line and what kind of a look that player got, if the player's hit a cross court passing shot, and he's looking through his opponent, I mean, I think it's a little bit situational at times, but anytime I think there's the potential for any kind of a dispute, I'm obviously wanting to be proactive. I guess I always feel like as chair umpires, as roving umpires, we need to be proactive in dealing with potential problems that might happen, if that's kind of the case.
Agreed. And I'd say, if you're going to, when we're talking about out signals, if you're going to err, err on the side of giving more than less.
Yeah, I definitely think I would err in that situation. Yeah, I would err on the side of that. Yes.
Now take your cue from the players. If you keep putting your finger up and a player looks at you and goes, "I know it's out," then you can back off a little bit on making the calls to that player.
Yeah, good point.
Okay. As a result of this change, do any of you expect to be a short? Okay, so we got a question. As a result of this change, do any of you expect to see a short-term increase in code violations for unsportsmanlike conduct because of disagreement with the officials' overrule? I'm gonna say I'm gonna go out on a limb while Rebel and Andrew think about it. I'm gonna say no. I don't. Does this mean we need to be accurate? Yes, it does. I mean, obviously, I think you're going to see a problem, but I think you see that problem even with the verbal appeal when you're inaccurate. When you really blow a call, whether you had a verbal appeal or not, and heck, I'm not going to lie, I've blown a call. I think any official who's honest has, right? I got, hell, and, I got an earful, whether or not there was a verbal appeal or not. So I don't see it. Where I think it's going to particularly be important that you be accurate is in doubles, because you have 4 people on the court. And if all 4 people are thinking, where the heck did you overrule that? That was nowhere near good, then you're going to have some credibility issues for the rest of the match.
And of course, we have 4 people checking our vision, and we're dealing with a larger court in doubles, so it just exacerbates the problem.
But I genuinely don't believe you're going to see an increase. I think if you're a bad official, I shouldn't say bad, if you're an inaccurate official, you are having those problems with whether there was a verbal appeal or not.
And once again, this still comes down to your credibility and how you make your overrules. So people, if you appear to be uncertain when you make overrules, they aren't going to believe you one way or the other. Whereas if you make a bad overrule, but you do it in a professional manner and you simply say, that's the way I saw it, then you have a lot better chance.
A great question from Vicky Wright, which, by the way, hi, Vicky. Was there an increase in the number of overrules when this was piloted? I can tell you at the men's team national indoors, there was not. I want to be clear. There has clearly been an increase in the number of overrules since the advent of no ad scoring. That has clearly, I believe, caused officials to need to overrule more. You know, the 15-30 point, the no ad, the deuce deciding point, the 15-40 point have all become so critical. And so I've definitely seen an increase from when we went to no ad. I did not see an increase in the number of overrules, based on this. Now, having said that, I also was a referee for one of the kickoff weekends that piloted it. It definitely means, to Vicky's question, it absolutely 100% means you need to be very careful about putting new people out, on collegiate matches. If you have someone, and we all know who they are, someone who always comes off every match with 8 to 10 overrules, that kind of person is going to be very dangerous. But I did not see an increase in that number. I don't know about what Rebel or Andrew, your experiences were.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you, Anthony. In response to your question, Vicky, is that at the women's indoor, I did not think that there was an increase in the overall number of overrules. As a matter of fact, I'm not aware of, but maybe one particular situation where we even got into the code with regards to overrules at the women's indoor. Maybe once or twice. It did not see, we were not getting through the end of the day and I had 4 officials come up to me, or we're having our morning meeting the next morning, and I had several officials saying, yeah, I had 3 overrules in every match yesterday. I did not see that kind of an increase. I do think, to your point a little bit earlier, Anthony, it definitely places an emphasis on accuracy for us. That we need to be sure. And just like you said, Rebel, earlier, I mean, we are only fixing, correcting calls that we're 100% sure of. But I did not notice a particular increase, or a noted increase, I should say, with regards to the total number. What were your thoughts, Rebel? I know you did a kickoff weekend.
Yeah, I was a referee for a dual gender site, so we had plenty of matches, and I do not recall it being an issue at all, either for either the men or the women. I was, I tracked the number of overrules, and they didn't seem to be excessive, different. It's a small sample size, but it certainly wasn't an outlier.
Yeah. And I will say that, I mean, I do say that I had at least 8 to 10 of the coaches at the women's indoor that came to me as the indoor was finishing and they were, leaving, or certainly by Sunday, went out of their way to make comments about how much they really felt like piloting this program benefited the overall sportsmanship at the event. And I think that's one of the reasons why we saw, as Anthony was saying, from the conversations in the OpCom meetings, is it may be somewhat surprising that it was such a unanimous or such a quick shift to do this. Is where it was piloted, we did have a tremendous amount of success with it. The coaches were really happy with the way that happened. Wouldn't you say that was probably the case at the men's indoor as well, Anthony?
Yeah, 100% agree.
Now, we do have another question here regarding, this official uses the term late calls. A late call we don't allow, but let's just say a player makes a slow call, and how is this going to impact us as we are going to, if we're overruling or not? And I think the answer is you can't overrule until you hear an incorrect out call. And even if they're slow on making the call, but not late, then you would overrule it the same as we've just discussed as soon as they've made that call. If they're truly late when they call out, then you're going to jump in and go too late.
Yeah, I completely agree with Rebel. I mean, we've all been in that situation, right? Where maybe the player did a hand signal and you just didn't see it. Sometimes the opponent didn't even see it. You say the score 30-15, the player walks up and says, no, I called that out. And you're like, oh, he called that out, and then the correction, the ball was good. You're going to do the overrule as quickly as you're aware that he called it out. And now obviously if you're doing that every point, that might be indicative of a technique problem on your side, but we've all had that just kind of one funky call in a match where you just missed the out call. Then you're going to do the overrule as quickly as you learn that in fact the ball was called out.
Anthony and Andrew, let me ask you a technique question here, or it might be a communications question first. Do you feel that we should be telling the players in the pre-match, on a close ball, please make your calls verbally? Because it gets difficult for us if we're engaged with that spot and a player is waving a finger someplace and they're on the other side of the court, almost out of our field of vision, maybe even out of our field of vision. So should we be asking them to make their calls verbally, or saying, if it's a close ball, better make your call verbally?
I think I like better make your call clearly, particularly on close calls.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say.
I don't, because the rule allows them to make a hand signal, I don't like deviating from the rule. But I do like the idea of being proactive and saying, make sure you give a signal. If it's a tight call, make sure it's a clear signal. I mean that's just
make sure something to the effect of make sure that I'm aware of your call, right? Like, I mean, just to kind of emphasize the fact that I, as the chair umpire, need to be made aware of your call. So I definitely think we can try to verbalize it that way, but I would tend to maybe agree with Anthony that since the rule allows for a visible call, we can, I don't want to deviate from that per se. But I do think that you're right. I mean, they have a responsibility to make us aware of that call. So we can emphasize that on a close ball, that, make sure that we're aware of your call. But like Anthony said, I mean, there's always that not always, but a lot of times we find ourselves in that one situation in a match where it's that one awkward time of I didn't see it or I didn't hear it, and players telling me they called it out. Depending upon the situation, a lot of times I'm willing to give it a free pass the first time it happens. But depending upon exactly the situation surrounding it, I mean, if I'm sure it didn't happen, then I'm obviously going to go down that road. But if a lot of times we're but we definitely don't want to have a situation where, every other game or 3 or 4 times during a match, we're not aware of a player making a call. That's a different issue altogether.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
I'm going to ask this to Rebel and Andrew since they're the ACC officials. I have not done an ACC match, so I love the question, and I love asking it and not having to answer it. And this comes from Mr. Clausen. In doubles with an assistant chair at the opposite net post, after every first serve out call on close calls, do you delay the server to repeatedly refer to the assistant or wait for some reaction?
I think this is a question better addressed to Brad Taylor. And unfortunately, Brad is not on this webinar tonight. But it's an excellent question, Al, because and the reason it's an excellent question, some people might not understand the nuance here. In the ACC, that far side person is the assistant chair umpire who stands at the net post opposite the chair. And that person can be asked for an opinion on any line, not just the far sideline. So, what Al's bringing up is ball goes up the center or ball is on the back service line and it's close, and you want to ask your far side for guidance on it. This can get pretty hairy. Like I said, I'm gonna defer to Mr. Taylor, and Al, we'll get that information out to you post haste. And Andrew, do you have anything more to add?
I will just defer to I think that's we'll just defer to Brad on how how that's going to handle it.
Rebel, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead. I was just going to bring up this subject that Courtney had suggested to us. Most of our officiating in collegiate tennis is roving, not chair umpiring. And I'm interested in you two's opinions on what positioning is essential for a roving umpire in order to be able to overrule.
You came in a little broken. What was the exact question, Rebel, at the end there?
Okay, where does a roving umpire need to be positioned in order to be able to overrule?
I believe this, regardless of this rule, I believe that the roving umpire should always be at the net post. I understand what the rule says, in clear observation and stuff, but I believe in terms of professionalism and selling your job and everything else, the rover needs to be at the net post to overrule. I think this rule just makes that even more important. I think if you're going to try and do the overrule, from outside the net while you're, through a fence or, across something, even though you're in quote unquote direct observation, I think that is just bringing up a whole host of arguments for the player or coach to raise to you as to how you did not see that ball accurately or how you're interjecting yourself while you're not even on the court. So my advice for rovers, and it's certainly all of the national championships where we do a little bit of roving that I'm the referee at, they have to be on the court at the net post, arm's distance from the net post, to make the overrule or to be involved on any other call.
Yeah, and I think that it's maybe, I don't know if we want to talk about maybe somewhat of a I think as good practice in roving and ITA officiating is is the sense of active roving where we're at the net post. And and I think I had a coach explain it to me one time, like, we totally understand you can't see everything all the time, but by standing at the net post, we know that you should be able to see at least something some of the time. And I think by standing at that net post, it certainly indicates that we have a good control over what's happening right in front of us. If we're standing off a court or through a fence, we may be able to see 3 or 4 courts casually, but we're not able to I don't think make a judgment decision on a line call on something that's happening right in front of us through a fence, or from behind the baseline, or anything along those lines.
Rebel, you answered this question in the chat box, but it's probably important that everyone hear it. Good question submitted by Mr. Alston from Southern California. Does this new rule also include let calls?
Are you waiting for me to say yes?
Yes, I am.
And the answer is yes. So yes, when a player, and Joseph Alston, I assume, is referring to service let calls, and
Yeah.
the answer is a service let is something that you can overrule, and if you do, you must do it immediately and not upon appeal. So let me ask you, Anthony, one that's not on here then, is if one player calls a through on a ball struck by their opponent, can you overrule that?
Well, I can see both answers to this, but I'm going to say yes. I am going to, you can overrule any call that you're convinced is 100% incorrect. So, a player calls a through, but you're at the net post either as a rover or in the chair, and you're 100% that ball went over the net. Yeah, you say correction, the ball was good, loss of point.
Yep, I agree.
Because there they've stopped playing correctly on a call they made.
I just thought that might give you a little pause.
Oh, it did. A little sweat. Okay. Any other questions? These guys these are all great questions, and you guys are all thinking about this rule and its application right where you should be.
Let me add on to the service let situation. I am always, as an umpire in direct observation of a court, going to err on the side of upholding or agreeing with a service let call. I've got to be just absolutely certain that it was that service let call was made an error before I'm going to overrule it. Once D1 men did away with service lets, we pretty much stopped overruling service let calls as far as I can remember. I can't remember overruling a service let call in the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty good point. And certainly as we think of situations where we're doing early in the season, where we're indoors and it's loud and there's lots of other things going on, service lets are difficult. We don't have a great view of that from the chair. So that's a tough. I mean, I'm certainly not going to say I've never done it, because I know I have, and I'm sure we all have at times. But that's definitely a call that we need to be very, very sure of before we're jumping in there.
There's a question. You have not discussed coaches' reactions to overrules. I'm not sure. I'm not sure exactly what the question means, but I don't think anything changes here. A coach can come up and I'm going to give them a few seconds. Once again, it's going to be somewhat situational. It's the very first point of a match, and I'm 100% convinced that ball was on the line. I'm not going to give the coach that much time to address that issue. But if it's the second set tiebreak and I overruled it 6-all, I'm going to understand that coach might be have a little bit more time to argue his point, a little. So there's going to be somewhat situational, but it's not going to change. The coach can argue that I was wrong. They're going to need to be professional. They're not going to be able to use profanity. They're subject to the coach's code of conduct at all times. But yes, I am going to give them a few seconds to, on any call that I've overruled, to explain to me that I was wrong or that I missed it, or whatever their point is. It's not going to take 45 seconds, and no, they're not going to be able to use profanity. So I really don't think anything changes there. It would be handled the same way whether there was a verbal appeal or not. Andrew or Rebel, anything different?
No, the coach's code of conduct is there for a reason. And the fact that we've changed this procedure doesn't change the coach's code of conduct.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think coaches are always, professionally have the ability or are allowed to disagree with the way we see something. And it's the same thing I know that I've heard you talk about in coaches meetings, and I've talked about in coaches meetings is, if you come up to me and express professionally a disagreement with something that a chair umpire did, or say the same thing to a chair umpire, I have no, that's certainly allowed. And to your point, exactly, Rebel. By the same token, nothing has changed with our procedures for how we're dealing with unsportsmanlike conduct, code violations to a player who's received, his third, or they've received their third overrule. Nothing's changing with regards to how we're dealing with those situations. So those are still all tools that we have to deal with our management of our matches. And so those procedures haven't changed. If a player gets overruled, the third time, that's still going to result in a code violation. Nothing's changing there.
As we wind this down, one comment I wanted to make, I had in my notes to talk about. I was adamantly opposed to this rule initially. I had argued against it. I would try to get them to delay it. I will say this after having it implemented and working on it at 4 fall national championship events, and then the women's and men's team indoor. All of those tournaments were fundamentally this isn't even related so much to being in the chair or being the referee, but the entire tenor of the match had changed, and for the better. At the women's team indoors, I have never been a part of so many 4-3 matches. We had one day that all 4 matches that my side did, all of them went 4-3, every single one, and there was not one sportsmanship issue. And that is unusual. Also, even though at the men's, the fundamental interactions of the players was different. There was no denying, whether you agree with this rule or disagree with this rule, like what it does or doesn't, I simply could not deny that the sportsmanship was better in the matches. Coaches weren't playing as many games because I do think coaches tried to get on the officials, and players weren't talking across the net as much at all. And so I will say that as just a side effect, not really related to its implementation. And it did convince me that, okay, you know what, this rule is worth trying. I want to see how it goes on a wide scale level, because I do think sportsmanship improved. That's kind of my closing comment.
I think that's well said, and I think it may bring back to kind of one of the things that we touched on a little bit earlier about players that are still appealing, and your comment about players talking across the net to their opponent. I think this rule in particular is where we are. We need to be shutting those types of situations down immediately. And I think those are the kinds of things that we can, quickly, like you had said, we can quickly remind a player. We're going to cover this in our pre-match, but let's say, we're 3/4 of the way through the first set. There's a tight call on the baseline, and that player immediately is talking across the net to his opponent about that, whether or not that ball was in or out. That's something that we can, quickly deal with and remind that player immediately that, hey, I reminded you in the pre-match, I will correct any obvious mistakes. You do not need to. You don't need to appeal any calls. Those are the kinds of behaviors that we need to be kind of curtailing, and those are the kinds of behaviors that I think specifically the coaches were had grown frustrated with, and then I think that's why one of the main reasons we're seeing this being implemented is because of those kinds of things, and I think that's what we need to be aware of and be mindful to cut down on.
We have one more question here, and an interesting scenario in a way from Ed Wexler, who's asking about a coach overruling their player before you call the overrule, and what should you do? The answer is this is no different from any other overrule or non-overrule situation. The fact that the coach inserted themselves before you could get any words out don't impact what's going to happen. Either you were going to overrule or you weren't. If the ball hits, it's called out, and the coach immediately goes, no, it was good. Before you can even say a word, you can say, if you were going to overrule, you could say, Coach, I got this. Correction, the ball was good. Or if you weren't going to overrule, you can simply say, that's fine. I wasn't sure that it hit the line, and still announce the score, because a coach is allowed to take a point away from their player at any time. But if the coach takes a point away from their player, overrules the player that you were not going to overrule, it does not count in the schedule of overrules. And that was met with deafening silence. I think we've gotten down to the bitter end of this thing, Andrew and Anthony.
Agreed. Was answering one question. With that, I think we have discussed this at length. If you have any other questions, I know Rebel, Andrew, and myself are all open. You can email us. All of our emails have been published, at the various webinars. You can also find it on ZebraWeb. I'm sure any of us wouldn't. I know Rebel and Andrew would not mind at all answering any other questions. I want to thank both Rebel and Andrew for their time. I want to thank all of you for putting in your time. It's 137 people, which is, to me, mind-blowing that there's that many people committed to, improving their craft and trying to be the best official that they can be. Have a great evening. And also, if you know other people who couldn't get into the class, Courtney has made sure that this webinar is recorded, so it will be available shortly on ZebraWeb for anyone to listen to. So please let them know that if there's someone you knew who couldn't get in or couldn't be here. And with that, I'm going to say have a good evening and sign off for the group.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.